The worst betrayals don't begin with a lie. They begin with someone choosing silence. That was the thought running through my head as I stared at the wedding photo glowing on my phone screen at 11:47 on a rainy Thursday night. The apartment around me was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the steady tapping of rain against the kitchen window. My mug of coffee had gone cold almost an hour ago, untouched, forgotten beside a stack of unfinished sketches. On the screen, Noah Carter smiled with the same warm eyes that had once convinced me I would never have to face the world alone. Standing beside him, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and one hand resting confidently on Noah's shoulder, was Logan Hayes, my high school bully. The guy who had spent years reminding me that I was too awkward, too quiet, too sensitive, too easy to laugh at. The man who somehow ended up becoming my ex-boyfriend's husband. I expected my chest to tighten. I expected tears. Maybe even anger. Instead, I felt nothing. Just an odd emptiness that settled over me like fresh snow, cold but strangely peaceful. 3 years earlier, that picture would have shattered me into pieces too small to put back together. Tonight, it barely made me blink. I zoomed in anyway, studying their smiles the way people examine old crime scenes, hoping to understand how everything had gone so terribly wrong. Noah looked happy, or maybe he simply looked practiced. Logan looked exactly the way I remembered, polished, confident, impossibly handsome, the kind of man people trusted before he even spoke. Some people are talented at making the world believe they're kind. Logan had always been one of them. My phone buzzed with another notification. Congratulations flooded the comments beneath the picture. Perfect couple. Soulmates. Finally found forever. I let out a laugh that surprised even me. If strangers only knew the story hiding behind those polished wedding photos, they would probably stop calling it a fairy tale. I locked my phone and carried my cold coffee to the sink. Outside, headlights reflected across the wet street below my apartment, turning puddles into ribbons of gold and silver. Somewhere in the city, Noah was probably celebrating the happiest day of his life. Somewhere in the same city, I was realizing that my happiest day had quietly arrived without him. Funny how healing works. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It sneaks in while you're busy surviving. But if you're wondering why seeing my first love marry the man who made my teenage years miserable didn't destroy me, then you need to know who we were before any wedding rings, before any apologies, before anyone came back begging. Because every ending has a beginning, and ours started in the one place I spent years wishing I could forget, Jefferson High School. Jefferson High School smelled like floor wax, old textbooks, and burnt cafeteria pizza, and somehow every hallway carried the feeling that everyone already knew where they belonged except me. I was the kid who always arrived 10 minutes early because sitting alone in a quiet classroom felt safer than walking through crowded corridors. I kept my sketchbook tucked against my chest like armor, filling every empty page with drawings of places I wished I lived instead of the one I woke up in every morning. Logan Hayes never missed an opportunity to remind me that people like me were easy to notice for all the wrong reasons. He did not have to shout or make a scene. Sometimes all it took was a sarcastic smile, a clever comment, or a laugh loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. The worst part was never what he said. It was how quickly everyone else laughed with him. After a while, I started believing that disappearing would be easier than trying to fit in. Then Noah Carter transferred into our junior year history class. He walked in carrying too many books, smiled at the teacher like they had known each other forever, and somehow apologized after accidentally bumping into my desk. Nobody had apologized to me for something that small before. It felt strangely important. We became partners on a research project about national parks, and instead of doing all the talking, Noah asked questions. Real questions. He wanted to know why I liked drawing old buildings, why I preferred rainy afternoons, and why every landscape in my notebook had an empty bench somewhere in the picture. I remember laughing because nobody had ever noticed that detail before. He said empty benches looked lonely until someone decided to sit down. That was the first time I wondered if kindness could actually change a person. Over the next few months, Noah quietly became part of my everyday life. We studied together at the public library on Saturdays. We grabbed burgers after football games neither of us actually cared about. He waited with me at the bus stop, even when his ride arrived first. Whenever Logan drifted too close with that familiar confident grin, Noah always found a reason to pull me into another conversation. He never turned it into a dramatic confrontation. He simply made sure I never felt completely alone. For someone like me, that mattered more than grand speeches ever could. I started believing that maybe high school was not something I had to survive anymore. Maybe it could become a chapter worth remembering. Looking back now, I realize hope can be just as blinding as fear. I mistook consistency for permanence. I believed that because Noah always chose my side once, he always would. At 17 years old, forever sounded believable when spoken by someone with honest eyes and a gentle voice. I did not know that people can keep every promise they mean in the moment and still become strangers later. I only knew that for the first time in years, walking through those hallways no longer felt like carrying the whole world by myself. The years after graduation unfolded so naturally that I never questioned where they were taking us. Noah and I rented a tiny apartment on the north side of the city, the kind with squeaky hardwood floors, mismatched kitchen cabinets, and windows that let in far more winter air than they should have. We laughed about how we would replace everything once we had real careers. I worked freelance as an illustrator, chasing deadlines from coffee shops and bookstores, while Noah landed an entry-level position at one of the fastest-growing marketing firms downtown. We celebrated every small milestone like it was a national holiday. His first paycheck became takeout from our favorite diner. My first major client earned us a second-hand couch that leaned slightly to the left, but somehow became our favorite place to spend Sunday afternoons. Life was not glamorous, but it felt honest, and I believed honesty was enough. Then the promotion started. Noah stayed later at the office. At first, it made sense. He wanted to prove himself. I encouraged him to chase every opportunity because I genuinely believed his success was our success. He would come home exhausted, loosen his tie, apologize for missing dinner, and promise that next week would be different. I believed him every single time. Small changes rarely announced themselves as warnings. They arrived disguised as ordinary inconveniences. Our evening walks became once a week, then once a month. Movie nights turned into canceled plans because another client dinner appeared on his calendar. The coffee he used to bring me every Friday morning quietly disappeared without either of us mentioning it. None of those moments seemed important by themselves, but together they formed a silence neither of us knew how to cross. One Friday evening, Noah invited me to a company networking event. I almost declined because I hated crowded rooms filled with strangers pretending to enjoy expensive appetizers. But he smiled and said he wanted everyone to meet the person who had supported him from the beginning. Hearing those words erased every hesitation. The ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers, and conversations blended into a constant wave of polished laughter. Noah introduced me to co-workers whose names I forgot almost instantly. Then someone called his name from across the room. I turned before he did. Logan Hayes. He looked older, sharper, dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. For a brief second, surprise flickered across his face before it transformed into a perfectly practiced smile. He shook Noah's hand like they were old friends and looked at me as though high school had been nothing more than a harmless misunderstanding. Noah seemed genuinely pleased to discover they worked in the same division. They joked about clients, deadlines, and office politics. While I stood beside them holding a sparkling water I no longer wanted to drink. Logan even apologized for not recognizing me at first, his voice calm and polished enough that anyone listening would have believed we had simply lost touch after graduation. As we drove home that night, Noah mentioned how surprising it was that Logan had changed so much. I stared out the passenger window as city lights blurred across the rain-streaked glass. People do change, I said quietly. The words sounded hopeful when they left my mouth. Deep down, however, something I could not explain had already begun whispering that this reunion was not a coincidence. It was the first crack in a foundation I had spent years believing could never break. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the city in faded shades of amber and gray. And somewhere between the changing leaves and shorter afternoons, Noah began slipping farther away from me without either of us admitting it out loud. At first, I blamed the new responsibilities that came with his promotion. He answered emails during dinner. Weekend breakfasts became conference calls. His phone buzzed long after midnight, lighting up the bedroom with cold blue light while I pretended to stay asleep. Every apology sounded sincere. Every promise to make more time felt genuine. That was what made it so difficult to notice the difference between someone who was temporarily busy and someone who was slowly building a life that no longer included you. Logan's name appeared more and more often in ordinary conversations. They had worked together on another presentation. Logan had introduced Noah to an important client. Logan recommended a new restaurant near the office. Each story sounded harmless by itself, and I hated the voice inside my head that whispered old memories every time I heard his name. I reminded myself that high school had ended years ago. Mature adults were supposed to move forward. Holding on to old pain felt childish, so I buried my discomfort behind polite smiles and changed the subject whenever I could. One Saturday afternoon, I stopped by Noah's office with sandwiches from the deli we both loved. It was supposed to be a surprise. The receptionist smiled kindly and pointed me toward a conference room at the end of the hallway. Before I reached the door, I heard laughter. Noah's laugh. It came easily, freely, the same laugh I had not heard at home in weeks. Through the glass wall, I saw him and Logan leaning over the same laptop, teasing each other about something on the screen. Noah looked relaxed, almost weightless. For a moment, I simply stood there holding two paper bags that suddenly felt much heavier than lunch should have. Then Noah noticed me. His smile faltered for only a second before returning. "Ethan, you should have texted. We are almost finished here." Logan greeted me with effortless warmth, thanking me for bringing lunch as though we had always been friends. I nodded, forced a smile, and left the sandwiches behind because I no longer felt hungry. That evening, Noah wrapped an arm around my shoulders while we watched television, but something had changed. His embrace felt familiar, yet distant, like reading a favorite book whose ending had quietly been rewritten. The weeks that followed filled themselves with tiny disappointments. He forgot our anniversary dinner because of a client event. He canceled a weekend trip we had planned for months. He began saying Logan understood the pressure at work in ways I could not, because Logan was living the same experience every day. Those words lingered long after the conversation ended. I did not want to compete with anyone for the attention of the person who once made me feel like I was enough. One rainy night, I found Noah standing alone on our apartment balcony, staring at the city lights without saying a word. I stepped beside him and slipped my hand into his. He squeezed it gently, but his eyes never left the skyline. The silence between us was no longer comfortable. It was crowded with sentences neither of us seemed brave enough to say. Looking back now, I realize relationships rarely collapse all at once. They unravel one quiet evening at a time until the person beside you feels farther away than someone living on the other side of the country, even while standing only inches from your shoulder. Winter arrived earlier than anyone expected that year. Frost clung to the edges of our apartment windows each morning, and the little space that once felt warm with shared dreams suddenly seemed much too large for only two people trying to pretend nothing had changed. Noah spent more nights at the office than at home, and eventually he stopped offering explanations unless I asked first. Even then, his answers sounded rehearsed, polished enough to end the conversation without truly inviting one. I kept telling myself that every difficult season eventually passed. I just did not realize ours had already ended long before I was willing to admit it. The conversation that changed everything happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening. There were no thunderstorms, no dramatic music, no shattered dishes. Just leftover pasta warming in the microwave and the quiet buzz of the heater struggling against the cold outside. Noah walked through the front door looking exhausted, loosened his tie, and stood in the kitchen without taking off his coat. I remember noticing how unusual that was before he even spoke. "Ethan, we need to talk." Those 4 words have a way of making every room feel smaller. I sat across from him at the tiny kitchen table where we had celebrated birthdays, planned vacations we never took, and dreamed about the future as if it belonged to both of us forever. Noah folded his hands together and stared at them instead of at me. He said he had changed. He said work had changed him. He said he no longer knew who he was or what he wanted. Every sentence landed softly, carefully chosen, almost gentle. Somehow that hurt more than anger ever could have. Then he finally looked at me and quietly admitted that he thought we should end our relationship. I waited for him to tell me there was someone else, but he insisted there was not. He said I deserved someone who could give me the attention and certainty that he no longer could. I searched his face for the boy who had once waited with me at the bus stop just because he did not want me standing there alone. I could not find him anywhere. A week later, he moved out with only a few boxes and a promise that he never intended to hurt me. The apartment echoed. After the door closed behind him, his favorite mug still sat beside the coffee maker because he forgot to pack it. I stared at it for nearly an hour before finally placing it in a cabinet I never opened again. Friends told me time would help. My sister insisted I should block his number. I did neither. I simply learned how to exist one ordinary day at a time. Then, exactly 5 weeks after we separated, my phone lit up while I was waiting in line at a grocery store. Someone from high school had posted engagement photos. I almost kept scrolling until I recognized Noah's smile. Standing beside him, wearing an expensive suit and a polished expression that looked perfect for every camera, was Logan. The caption wished them a lifetime of happiness. My shopping basket slipped from my hand, oranges rolling across the floor while strangers hurried to help me gather them. They probably thought I was embarrassed. The truth was much simpler. In that single quiet moment beneath the bright grocery store lights, I realized I had not only lost the man I loved, I had lost him to the one person I never believed he would choose. People like to say heartbreak changes you overnight, but they never talk about the quiet years that come afterward, the ones where healing happens so slowly that you only recognize it when you accidentally smile, without forcing yourself. The first few months after Noah left were the hardest. I threw myself into freelance illustration because blank pages were easier to face than empty rooms. One client became three. Three became a waiting list. Eventually, a small publishing company hired me to illustrate a series of children's books, and for the first time since college, my work paid enough that I could move into a brighter apartment with large windows overlooking a neighborhood park. Every morning, I watched parents walking their children to school, dog owners chatting over coffee, and runners greeting complete strangers with easy smiles. Life continued whether I was ready for it or not, and little by little, I started joining it again. Nearly 3 years passed before I met Adrian Cole. It happened at an independent bookstore during a local art exhibition where several of my illustrations were hanging on the walls. I noticed him because he spent almost 10 minutes studying one drawing of an old park bench beneath a maple tree. Most people looked for a few seconds before moving on. Adrian stayed. When I finally introduced myself, he smiled and admitted he had been trying to figure out why every illustration felt nostalgic without being sad. I laughed because years earlier Noah had asked me almost the same question. The difference was that Adrian listened carefully to the answer instead of trying to finish my sentences. He was an architect who loved restoring historic buildings instead of replacing them. He believed beautiful things deserved another chance if their foundations were still strong. I found myself wondering if people worked the same way. We started meeting for coffee on Saturday mornings, then museum visits, then long walks through downtown where conversations wandered from favorite movies to childhood memories without ever feeling rushed. Adrian never asked me to become someone more confident or more outgoing. He simply made room for the person I already was. Being around him felt peaceful in a way I had forgotten relationships could be. There were no games, no uncertainty, no constant guessing about where I stood. One evening, after helping me carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs, he noticed an old ceramic mug sitting alone on the highest kitchen shelf. I had forgotten it was even there. He asked if it had a story. I looked at it for a long moment before smiling softly and saying it belonged to someone who helped shape my past, but no longer belonged in my future. Adrian nodded without asking another question. That quiet respect meant more than any speech could have. For the first time in years, I believed love could feel calm instead of confusing. Then, on another rainy Thursday night, while organizing reference photos for my next illustration project, my phone vibrated with a message from a number I had deleted but somehow still recognized before opening it. It contained only 6 words. "Ethan, can we please talk?" It was the first message I had received from Noah in nearly 3 years, and somehow, despite everything that had happened, my heart remembered his name before my mind reminded it why it should not. For nearly an hour, I stared at Noah's message without replying. 6 words should not have carried that much weight, yet they somehow pulled memories out of corners of my mind that I thought time had permanently sealed away. Adrian noticed my silence before I even realized I had stopped talking. We had been cooking dinner together, music playing softly from a speaker on the kitchen counter, when he looked up from slicing vegetables and asked if everything was all right. I handed him my phone without saying a word. He read the message, looked back at me, and simply asked, "What do you want to do?" Not what should you do? Not what would make him comfortable. What do you want? That simple question reminded me how different my life had become. I answered the message with only one sentence. Tomorrow, 5 o'clock, Riverside Coffee. Noah arrived 15 minutes early. I recognized him immediately through the cafe window, sitting alone with both hands wrapped around a paper cup that had long since stopped steaming. The expensive confidence he once carried so effortlessly had disappeared. His suit fit loosely, dark circles rested beneath tired eyes, and the first streaks of gray touched his temples. When I walked inside, he stood so quickly that he nearly knocked over his chair. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he smiled sadly. "You look happy," he said. "I am," I answered honestly. We sat across from each other as rain tapped gently against the windows. Noah apologized before ordering coffee, before asking about my life, before saying anything else. The words came slowly, as though each one had to fight its way out. He admitted that marrying Logan had been the biggest mistake of his life. He said the charming man everyone admired had slowly become someone impossible to truly know. Every disagreement became a competition. Every success had to belong to Logan. Every conversation somehow circled back to control, appearances, or winning. Noah confessed that he spent years trying to convince himself the marriage only needed more patience, more understanding, more effort. Instead, he gradually realized he had been living beside someone who valued victory far more than partnership. Then he looked directly into my eyes and quietly said something I never expected to hear. A few months ago, Logan admitted that none of this happened by accident. I felt my heartbeat slow. Noah continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Logan had confessed that he remembered me from high school the moment they met again at work. Becoming friends with Noah had started as a game. He wanted to prove that he could take away the one person who had once made me believe I was not alone. At first, Noah refused to believe him, thinking it was only another cruel joke. But Logan smiled and described details about my teenage years that no stranger could possibly know. He even admitted that watching our relationship fall apart had made him feel like he had finally won. Noah lowered his head into trembling hands. "I thought I was choosing a better future," he whispered. "I never realized I had become part of someone else's revenge." I listened without interrupting. His pain was real. His regret was unmistakable. But sitting there across from him, I also understood something that had taken me years to learn. Logan may have opened the door, but Noah had still been the one who chose to walk through it. Noah did not ask me to forgive him right away. He did not reach across the table or make dramatic promises. Instead, he quietly told me everything he wished he had understood years earlier. He admitted that love was never lost in a single moment. It disappeared one ignored conversation, one broken promise, and one selfish decision at a time. He said he spent countless nights replaying every memory of our tiny apartment, remembering the coffee we used to share before work, the old couch where we planned impossible vacations, and the way I always left the hallway light on whenever he worked late because I wanted him to come home to something warm. I listened without interrupting. The rain outside had slowed to a gentle drizzle, and the cafe had become almost empty except for a college student studying near the window, and an elderly couple quietly sharing a slice of pie. Life continued all around us while the past sat between us like a third person neither of us could ignore. Finally, Noah looked at me with tears gathering in his tired eyes. He asked if there was any chance we could begin again. The question hung in the air longer than either of us expected. 3 years earlier, I would have answered before he even finished speaking. Now I simply took a slow breath and thought about everything that had happened since we last sat across from each other. I thought about the lonely nights after he left. I thought about learning to trust myself again. Most of all, I thought about Adrian. That evening, after leaving the cafe, I found Adrian waiting outside my apartment building exactly where he said he would be. He never asked for updates through endless text messages. He never demanded to know what Noah had said. He simply smiled when he saw me and handed me a paper bag from my favorite bakery because he remembered I usually forgot to eat whenever I felt overwhelmed. We walked through the neighborhood park beneath rows of glowing streetlights while the cool evening air carried the scent of wet leaves. Eventually, I told him everything. I expected uncertainty or jealousy. Instead, Adrian quietly listened until I finished. Then he stopped beside the old maple tree overlooking the pond and said something I will never forget. The fact that someone finally understands your value does not mean they are entitled to another chance. Sometimes the greatest apology is accepting the consequences of your own choices. His words settled gently inside me, not as advice, but as clarity. The next afternoon, I met Noah one last time. He looked hopeful the moment he saw me, and that made what I had to say even more difficult. I thanked him for apologizing. I told him I truly believed he regretted the decisions he had made. I also told him that forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same thing. I had already forgiven him long before he sent that message because carrying resentment had become too heavy. But forgiveness had freed me to move forward, not backward. I smiled softly and wished him a future, filled with wiser choices and genuine peace. As I stood to leave, Noah quietly whispered that losing me had been the greatest mistake of his life. I nodded gently before walking toward the door, knowing that for the first time since Jefferson High School, I was no longer choosing the person who had once rescued me. I was choosing the life I had rescued for myself. Spring arrived with the kind of gentle warmth that made the entire city feel as though it had been given permission to begin again. Cherry blossoms lined the streets outside the botanical garden where Adrian and I had chosen to celebrate our wedding with a small gathering of family and close friends. There were no extravagant decorations, no towering ice sculptures, and no orchestra playing dramatic music. We wanted something that felt honest. White flowers, soft laughter, handwritten vows, and the people who had quietly stood beside us while we built this life together. As I adjusted my tie in the dressing room, I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the nervous young man who had once believed his happiness depended entirely on someone else's choices. The person looking back at me now carried the same face, but a very different heart. One that had been broken, repaired, and strengthened in ways I could never have imagined. Adrian squeezed my shoulder before the ceremony began. He smiled the same calm smile that had first caught my attention in the bookstore years earlier. "Ready?" he asked. I laughed softly, more than I have ever been. The ceremony passed in what felt like only a few beautiful moments. We promised to choose each other not only on easy days, but also during ordinary ones, because we had both learned that lasting love was built far more often in quiet routines than in grand declarations. As applause filled the garden, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the back beneath a flowering tree. Noah. He had come alone. He did not interrupt the celebration or try to speak to me during the ceremony. When the reception began, he quietly approached while Adrian was greeting relatives nearby. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then Noah offered a small gift wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside was the old ceramic mug he had accidentally left behind years ago. Somehow, he had found a way to retrieve it after all this time. A small note rested inside. It read, "Thank you for loving me when I had not yet learned how to love someone the right way. I hope your future is everything I failed to protect." I looked up, and Noah smiled with a sadness that no longer asked for anything in return. I thanked him sincerely. We shook hands, not as former lovers trying to recover what had been lost, but as two people finally accepting that some chapters are meant to end so better ones can begin. He wished Adrian and me a lifetime of happiness before quietly walking away through the garden gates without looking back. I watched him disappear into the afternoon sunlight, and for the first time, the memory of us no longer hurt. It simply existed, like an old photograph tucked safely into a drawer that no longer needed to be opened. Later that evening, as Adrian and I walked home beneath a sky painted in soft shades of orange and blue, he reached for my hand. I smiled and held it without hesitation. Years ago, I believed the greatest tragedy was losing the person I loved. I know better now. The greatest tragedy would have been losing myself while trying to hold on to someone who had already let go. Sometimes life allows people to return, not so the story can begin again, but so both hearts can finally understand why it had to end. And sometimes the happiest ending is not the one where someone comes back. It is the one where you discover you no longer need them to.